The science adventure series features some of the greatest stories I've ever had the pleasure of going through, but it is unfortunately infamous for one thing in particular: having horrifyingly rushed anime adaptations, often cramming extremely lengthy narratives into just one cour. Even for visual novel-derived anime standards, which are usually pretty bad anyways, most of the SciADV anime still land among the worst VN to anime adaptations of all time. Yet among all of these SciADV installments, there is one peculiar exception to this trend with anime adaptations, that being none other than speculative science ADV Steins Gate, the second and most popular SciADV entry. To this day, the Steins Gate anime is not only one of the best received visual novel-derived anime, but also one of the all-time best received anime in general. And this is for good reason. Excellent direction, solid animation, and most importantly, an episode count long enough to adapt its source material reasonably well. The Steins Gate visual novel is one of the shortest in the series, and yet it boasts the longest anime adaptation with 24 episodes, double what most of the rest of the series had received. And in this episode count, the Steins Gate anime also managed to make a few improvements upon the source material, such as with its pacing in the second half. You would think that based on such factors, as well as its general popularity and reception, that Steins Gate's anime would be a near-perfect adaptation. But the reality is that it is not without its problems. The day I'm uploading this video marks the Steins Gate anime's 14th anniversary, and I wanted to do something meaningful for the occasion. I first watched the Steins Gate anime all the way back in March of 2015, and still hold very fond memories of my experience with it. For a pretty good while afterwards, I would rewatch it yearly. But over the years, I found that my initial zeal for the Steins Gate anime eventually became quite muddled the deeper and deeper I got into SciADV. Once I had the proper context for the original Steins Gate visual novel, and then the overarching SciADV franchise, it became very apparent to me that there's a number of ways in which the Steins Gate anime is lacking. So in this video, I wanted to go over where I believe that the Steins Gate anime falls short, dare I say, fails, as an adaptation. It should go without saying that the remainder of this video will contain spoilers for the entire Steins Gate subseries. But in addition to a spoiler warning, I also wanted to give a trigger warning, since later on in this video I do also talk about suicide, which is a bit of a heavy topic. Anyhow, Steins Gate's anime is simultaneously one of the best and yet also one of the worst things to have ever happened to the SciADV franchise. On one hand, it is the best anime adaptation in the series by far, and it is because of Steins Gate's anime that the Steins Gate IP, and to an extent even the wider SciADV franchise, are as popular as they are. Many people, including myself, got into the SciADV franchise as a result of the Steins Gate anime. If the Steins Gate anime weren't good, then people wouldn't be interested in getting any more of it. But, the way I see it at least, the approach they took in making the Steins Gate anime forever damaged the SciADV IP because it tried to portray Steins Gate as far more standalone than it actually is. The Steins Gate anime is a really good anime, but in terms of actual faithfulness to the source, it leaves a lot to be desired. Steins Gate happens in large part as a direct consequence of the events of Chaos at Noah. The two stories share the same central antagonist, and the mechanics of Steins Gate are only possible because of the mechanics of Chaos Head. For instance, the whole basis for the Time Leap machine is visual rebuilding technology, but the Steins Gate anime removes almost every mention of Chaos Head's mechanics and almost every reference to the events of Chaos Head. The anime even changes the identity of the story's central antagonist by virtue of how it omits every reference to the Committee of 300. This ultimately makes it seem as though the central antagonist of Steins Gate is CERN, when in fact it is the Committee of 300 that controls CERN the way that CERN controls the Rounders. Even foreshadowing for robotics notes, such as through the inclusion of Sister Centipede, is completely removed from the story in the Steins Gate anime. And then in addition to that, the Steins Gate anime almost completely omits an entire character from the story, that being Shido. His omission is pretty problematic for reasons that should be fairly obvious if you have wider series context. Annoying though he might be, he's supposed to be in the story for a reason. But really, the most pan-series connections that the Steins Gate anime leaves in are a Neidhart name drop, and, to leave it cryptic to avoid spoiling any Steins Gate onlys, a brief callback to the biggest twist of Chaos at Noah. Obviously, the context of this, and a number of other twists, are a massive game changer for anybody's understanding and experience of Steins Gate. But even if the Steins Gate anime were to retain more of the story's wider connections, the Chaos Head anime didn't cover much of this content, so anime onlys would be lacking this understanding anyways. A good chunk of this important material is from two of the character roots in Chaos at Noah, one of which I have already made a video on. And in the first place, the Chaos Head anime is one of the worst adaptations of anything ever made, so it's not surprising that the creators wanted to separate Steins Gate from Chaos Head when in anime form just for marketability and reputation reasons. But because the Steins Gate anime did its absolute best to divorce Steins Gate from its connections to Chaos Head, a lot of people are under the misconception that the two stories have little to do with one another. Steins Gate, of course, due to only having one title in the series preceding it, definitely isn't as reliant upon prior entries as every other subsequent entry in the series is. But the reality is that Steins Gate's connections to Chaos at Noah are not simply minor references and Easter eggs, it's all significant story important content. They are parts of a longer overarching storyline, not separate standalone stories that just happen to take place in the same world. But as a direct consequence of the adaptation decisions made for the Steins Gate anime, and in conjunction with the way Mages has marketed the series, the overwhelming majority of Steins Gate fans aren't even aware that Steins Gate is just the second part of a longer story. Most just think it's its own standalone series, when that simply isn't true for the visual novel. As it stands, the overwhelming majority of Steins Gate fans are anime onlys, which makes sense. Anime is a much more popular and much more easily accessible medium than the likes of visual novels. Even when I was in 5th grade in 2012, my peers were talking about the Steins Gate anime and how cool it was. Elementary schoolers will definitely be watching anime, but they're not going to be reading visual novels. Even for adults, the time investment required for a visual novel is steeper than the time investment required for an anime. So evidently, anime would be the far more popular form of entertainment for both younger and older audiences. However, the way they made Steins Gate known without making SciADV itself known had seriously adverse effects on the franchise past the original Steins Gate. It led them to hyper-focusing on Steins Gate itself, and now there is a disturbingly disproportionate amount of Steins Gate material relative to non-Steins Gate material in the SciADV franchise. And even for the subsequent SciADV entries, Mages has often plastered Steins Gate all over their marketing, and even opted to include story elements to try and appeal to the Steins Gate only audience. Some stories were even outright entirely conceived to try and get Steins Gate fans into the rest of the series, like Robotics Notes Dash, where they make Daru from Steins Gate the protagonist, much to the story's detriment. Nonetheless, despite all my grievances with it, the decision to try and make Steins Gate more standalone isn't the most egregious thing that the anime does. Considering that part of an anime's aim is to get a new audience into a series, it's actually somewhat understandable, as much as I seriously despise what they did as a fan of SciADV itself. Anime is business before it is art, after all, and the primary purpose of an anime adaptation is to advertise and promote an IP. But even with those considerations, there are a number of other questionable decisions that the anime makes, like almost completely cutting Okabe's breakdown at the end of chapter 10, which is arguably the single most impactful moment of the entire story. Runtime considerations definitely played a part here, but if they just skipped the opening of that episode, they should have been able to include it without any problems. But all these aforementioned problems pale in comparison to one part of the anime adaptation in particular. Without any doubt in anybody's mind, the single worst area in which the Steins Gate anime fails as an adaptation is in its coverage of Chapter 9. The Steins Gate anime pulls off what just might be the single worst character assassination I've ever seen any adaptation do. Braun is one of the best, if not the best, character from the Steins Gate visual novel. And yet what the anime adaptation does to him is, frankly speaking, unforgivable. In Chapter 9 of the Steins Gate visual novel, Braun ultimately shoots himself, and for 3 reasons. First is, of course, because of despair. The way his life went, so many things were just entirely out of his control. He was effectively a dog on a leash, with no free will whatsoever, being forced into doing terrible things for CERN and the Committee of 300 in order for himself and Nye to live. Braun in the visual novel is an unbelievably tragic character. He's a victim of circumstance, not someone who's simply just evil for the sake of being evil. When he learned that Amane Suzuha was actually Hashida Suzu, and a time traveler who hated CERN at that, it was such a massive punch to the gut, a final nail in the coffin. Everything he'd been doing, despite all his best intentions, went completely against everything Hashida Suzu had stood up for. The one person Braun owed everything to. That hurt. The second reason he killed himself was to escape CERN's assailants and go off on his own terms. The Steins Gate visual novel establishes that Rounders and everyone else who works for CERN gets eliminated irrespective of whether or not they complete their mission successfully. Such measures are there to ensure secrecy, so even if he weren't to kill himself, CERN's assailants would kill him anyways because now that they got the IBN 5100, he was no longer useful. Relatedly, that leads us into the third reason he committed suicide, which was to try and save Moeka and Nye in his own way. To ensure compliance among the Rounders, CERN and the Committee of 300 would opt to threaten and or kill the relatives of any Rounders, as is what happened with Nye's mother Suzuri. By cutting Moeka off from the chain of Rounder command entirely and then offing himself, CERN and the Committee of 300 would have no reason to eliminate her. It was a loophole since Moeka was only connected to CERN through her connection to Braun. By severing it, she could live on happily. At least in theory. So at the end of the day, Braun's actions in Chapter 9 were primarily motivated by his desire to save Moeka, because he wanted to pay forward the kindness shown to him by Hashida Suzu in whatever way he could. If you read Brownian Motion of Love and Hate, this is even further made explicit in there too. His whole character was about trying to save Moeka. It's the biggest reason he was so responsive to her over text, as excessive as Moeka was with her messaging. Even in the Moeka route from My Darling's Embrace, Braun treats Moeka like a daughter that he just wants to help out in whatever way he can. But what do they do in the anime? First, they make the move from his house to this random deserted construction site on the silly pretense of not wanting Nye to hear and see anything. This guts out half the impact that Braun's death is supposed to have, since 1, he was driven to a point that he simply didn't care that Nye would hear and see the scene, and 2, it was in the very home that Hashida Suzu had given him. But far more offensive than omitting a big part of Braun's suicide and moving from Hashida Suzu's home to a construction site is what they end up doing there. Before Braun kills himself, they make it so that Braun kills Moeka, and for absolutely no reason. He straight up just kills the very person that his entire character arc is about trying to save. And for what? What reason would he have for killing her? None! In the anime, Braun doesn't even bother to explain why he shot Moeka. He spent his whole life trying to save her, just for him to kill her instead? What's the point of that? CERN shouldn't even go after her because her entire connection to them was via Braun. That was the whole idea behind cutting all contact with her. And in any case, Braun's whole idea is supposed to be for the whole chain of suffering to just end with himself. killing Moeka just defeats and destroys Braun's entire character. Frankly speaking, this is the single worst character assassination I've ever seen, and perhaps the most offensive adaptation decision I've ever witnessed. Even Chaos Ed's anime opting to omit Chapter 6 isn't this bad. But that's not the only part of Chapter 9 that the Steins Gate anime handles very differently. It also completely cuts out Time Leap Nae. In the visual novel, Nae is in a time loop. From the despair surrounding Braun's death, she becomes a CERN rounder. From there, she lives until 2025, where she tortures and kills Okabe, and then time leaps back countless times to go back to 2010 to kill Moeka and spite Okabe because she blames them for Braun's death. And then she lives all the way to 2025, kills Okabe again, only to repeat the cycle over and over. This is one of the most shocking and horrifying parts of the entire visual novel, and one that would come to have severe psychological ramifications on Okabe's psyche in multiple pieces of series content past the original Steins Gate. For instance, we see this pretty evidently in one of Steins Gate's sequels, Holy Day of the Calamitous Birth, where Okabe can't even look at Nae the same way anymore. And these parts would in turn also come to shape people's experience of other pieces of SciADV content too. It appears that for the most part, the main reasons these changes were made was because of the anime's runtime constraints. After all, while 24 episodes is a heck of a lot more than most of the rest of the series' anime adaptations, it still came with its restrictions. Thus, they had to make cuts somewhere, and a substantial chunk of these cuts ended up having to be in Chapter 9. But honestly, I think they could very easily have fit this series of events in had they opted to prioritize what truly mattered over the course of episodes 19 and 20. And if they were to additionally skip the opening and ending in at least one of these two episodes, as they did multiple times in the Steins Gate Zero anime, I believe that would have left them with adequate time to cover the important material decently. And there's so many earlier parts of Steins Gate that they could have chosen to omit in favor of prioritizing such a massively significant part of the story. Like, how many "but he's a guy" jokes do you need to keep in there? A huge chunk of Steins Gate is just filled with slice of life and character interactions. They already cut a fair bit of that out in the anime adaptation anyways, but couldn't they have cut more of that in favor of maintaining parts of the story that actually mattered so much more? I really just wish that they prioritized better. Even if Time Leap Nae might have been too gruesome to show on TV for some reason, at the very least, they shouldn't have made Moeka die at Braun's hands. All things considered, the Steins Gate anime is still a great adaptation and a great anime, at least in comparison to the other dumpster fire anime adaptations we've got for this series. It gets most of the story right, and there are even a few areas in which I believe the Steins Gate anime makes some genuine improvements upon the visual novel, and not just in pacing. A few moments are more impactful in the anime, such as in Chapter 4, where Okabe realizes that the entire scenery he observes is no longer what he remembered. Indeed, that's truly a moment that gets him to question if the scenery his eyes perceive is truly real. But nonetheless, the few improvements the anime makes to Steins Gate are entirely outweighed by there being even more areas in which the Steins Gate anime fundamentally falls short as an adaptation. With regards to conveying Steins Gate's wider series connections, prioritizing what moments in the game to retain, and in characterizing Braun, it falls short. Therefore, I cannot consider the Steins Gate anime a substitute for the visual novel for anyone looking to go through SciADV. Nonetheless, please let me know your overall thoughts on both the Steins Gate visual novel and Steins Gate anime all these years later. And in addition to that, I'd also love to hear your thoughts on the Steins Gate Zero anime, as well as Brownian Motion of Love and Hate, the manga that depicts Braun and Hashida Suzu's backstory. Personally, even with its noticeably poor direction, I really like the Steins Gate Zero anime, since as a result of worldline recursion, it actually contributes something to the overarching storyline by virtue of it functionally serving as a sequel to or final route for the Steins Gate Zero visual novel, rather than a conventional adaptation of it. The Steins Gate anime, in comparison, is just the same story as the visual novel, but done worse in a number of places. So despite its merits as an anime, it's just not nearly as useful to the overarching series as the Steins Gate Zero anime. And as for Brawny in Motion of Love and Hate, to this day, it's one of my favorite pieces of SciADV side material, and quite possibly my single favorite piece of Steins Gate side material. If you haven't gone through it, you're seriously missing out. And if you don't feel my frustration with the anime's characterization of Brawn just from the original visual novel alone, oh, you're definitely going to feel it after going through Brawny in Motion. Though with that in mind, see ya!